Lieutenant Zimmerman, I want to draw your attention back to the incident on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
Earlier, you told the jurors about being at the scene, finishing your work there. The next day, did you have an opportunity to review some video of that incident?
Yes.
And do you recall what that video, where you saw it?
Yes.
And was it we've been calling the Darnella Frazier video?
Yes.
Did you watch that video in its entirety?
Yes, I did.
And since then, have you had an opportunity to watch other video of the incident?
Yes.
And specifically, have you watched body-worn camera video of the incident from the involved officers?
Yes.
And based on that and your years of training and experience with the Minneapolis Police Department, you saw then Officer Chauvin with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, correct?
Yes.
Would you call what you saw there a use of force?
Yes.
And did that use of force continue until the ambulance arrived?
Yes, it did.
Was there any change in the level of force being used until the ambulance arrived?
No.
And what do you think about that use of force during that time period?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about that use of force during that time period?
I'm going to object to that phrase of that question.
A little vague. Could you limit it to the time frame?
Right. Okay. So, based on your review of the body-worn camera videos of the incident,
Yes.
and directing your attention to that moment when Mr. Floyd is placed on the ground,
Yes.
what is your view of that use of force during that time period?
Totally unnecessary.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, pulling him down to the ground, face down, and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
So, in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?
Absolutely.
And I should add to that question then also that it appeared he had stopped resisting.
I'm sorry?
And it appeared that he had stopped putting up any resistance.
Absolutely, I would stop.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
I may just have a moment, Your Honor. Good morning, Lieutenant Zimmerman.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
So you testified that you have been a Minneapolis police officer since June 5th, 1985, correct?
1985, yes.
And prior to that, you were with another agency?
Yes.
And when you initially came on to the Minneapolis Police Department, you were a patrol officer, correct?
Yes.
And you were a patrol officer from 1985 to approximately 1993 when you took the sergeant's exam and were promoted.
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that since 1993, so 27, 28 years, you've not been on patrol in the city of Minneapolis.
Correct.
Your assignments have been investigative in nature, correct?
Yes.
And generally speaking, an investigative role is more of a follow-up type role, right?
Yes.
So an incident occurs on the street, it gets assigned to a detective, and then your job is to investigate the circumstances of that incident, right?
Yes.
And so it's fair to say that since 1993, you've not, other than perhaps for ceremonial reasons, you've not worn a uniform on a daily basis.
Well, I don't know if I would call it ceremonial.
Well,
I had to wear a uniform.
You have to wear a uniform from time to time, but your daily role is as a clothed police officer, correct?
Yes.
And you're not out patrolling the streets, making arrests, things of that nature.
No.
All right. And it's fair to say then that your experience with the use of force of late has been primarily through training.
Through what?
Your training.
Yes.
All right. Meaning you're not out actively, other than perhaps arresting a homicide suspect, you're not out actively patrolling and arresting people for less serious offenses.
No.
Right. And so you describe the use of force continuum as including mere presence being a type of the use of force, right?
Yes.
And so when you arrive on scene as a lieutenant in the homicide unit, that is a use of force, right?
If people know I'm a lieutenant, yes.
Or if they know you're a police officer, perhaps. Right. And then you described like soft techniques like escort holds, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
And I'm assuming that in the last, since 1993, and you were promoted to sergeant, you've handcuffed some people in that time frame.
I have.
Right. When's the last time you got in a physical fight with a person?
About in 2018.
Okay, so it's been a couple of years since you've been in a physical fight with a person.
Yes.
All right. And so you would agree that the use of force as an investigator is, or the higher levels of force as an investigator, is less likely than a patrol officer.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
I'll rephrase it. The frequency with which you have to use higher levels of force as an investigator doesn't happen all that often, right?
Correct.
And so your experience generally as a use of force or involving the use of force is primarily in this annual what's called defensive tactics training, right?
Yes.
And the defensive tactics training is one of the requirements you need to use or to complete in order to maintain your license as a police officer, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that, or I'm presuming that since 1985 until the present day, tactics have changed as a police officer.
Some tactics have changed, yes.
Right. And it's fair to say that you are not a trainer in the Minneapolis Police Academy relevant to the use of force, correct?
That's correct, yes.
You do not teach other police officers defensive tactics.
No, I don't.
You would agree, however, that roughly 10 years ago, the Minneapolis Police Department kind of moved away from trying to hit people to control them and started using body weight to try to control people.
I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay, so you think that, I mean, within the arsenal, so to speak, of a police officer, it's as common to punch or strike someone in the use of force as it is to just use what are called takedown moves or body weight pins.
Yes.
Okay, and that's been throughout your entirety of your career?
Yes.
Okay, and so, and you're basing that again on your experience as just going through the defensive tactics requirements.
Right.
All right. And again, as a lieutenant and the #1 senior officer in the Minneapolis Police Department, I'm presuming that your understanding of the use of force involves the Minneapolis Police Department policies on the use of force, right?
Yes.
And the Minneapolis Police Department policies are designed, at least based on your understanding, to address the legal requirements for the use of force.
Yes.
And so there are factors, correct, to determine whether or not a use of force is proportional, reasonable, things of that nature, right?
Correct.
And what we look at in any particular case is the totality of the circumstances. Agreed?
Yes.
So there's lots of different information that a police officer has to use in order to determine the level of force to be used under which circumstances.
Yes.
Agreed?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department, are you familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking or critical decision-making model?
Yes.
And you would agree, I'm assuming again, based on a long career, that an officer is constantly taking in new information, and that information will affect the decisions he or she makes, right?
That's correct.
And would you also agree that the training that you received initially as a police officer is probably a lot different than the academy now?
Yes.
Obviously, the available tools that officers have are a lot different today than they were in 85, 90, 95.
Yes. Body
Cameras, they didn't exist when you first became a police officer.
That's correct.
Tasers were not a thing either, right?
No.
You carried a gun and some handcuffs and kind of old school cop, right?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the decision making of a police officer, would you agree that there are certain pieces of information that officer has that affect his or her decisions on the use of force?
Yes.
And some of that information is very immediate, kind of low-level information. Agreed?
Yes.
So, for example, what just happened with this particular suspect, right?
Yes.
Is this suspect under the influence of a controlled substance, or is he sober?
Yes.
Right? What are you looking at in that moment through your own eyes, right?
Yes.
That's the officer's experience in any situation, right?
Right.
You look at other things that may be hazards or threats in the immediate vicinity, correct?
Yes.
So you're going to assess, are there people watching? Are there people videotaping? Are those people happy or angry, etc., right?
Yes.
You're going to look at what we would refer to as scene security, right?
Yes.
You have a responsibility as a police officer for your partners who may be close to you, right?
Yes.
You have a responsibility as a police officer for all of the people in the immediate area, right?
Yes.
And so scene security is kind of trying to keep it as tight as possible and keep everybody in the area safe. Agreed?
That's correct. Everybody.
In turn, you were asked a series of questions about your an officer's medical responsibilities.
I'm sorry?
You were asked a series of questions about your medical training and an officer's medical, what they're supposed to do.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And even in the assessment of a medical emergency, there are many factors that come into that assessment, correct?
Yes.
To your knowledge, Minneapolis police officers they're trained medically at a fairly low level. They're not paramedics, doctors, etc.
That's correct.
You're a first responder.
Yes.
Basically, you're taught how to apply tourniquets, patches for gunshots, stop bleeding, basic CPR, and resuscitative efforts, right?
That's correct.
A police officer's job primarily is to keep the scene safe. Agreed?
I'm sorry?
A police officer's responsibility is to keep the scene secure and safe. Agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis police policy requires the involvement of a higher level of medical intervention if the circumstances dictate, correct?
Yes.
And an officer is required, if someone is having a medical emergency, to take what steps are they're able to reasonably in the moment, right?
Yes.
And that would include potentially calling EMS.
That's correct.
But then, so you've got all of these immediate factors, right, that come into play. But then you can kind of widen that lens a little bit, and there are some other factors that come into play in terms of the use of force, again, based on your training and experience.
Yes.
Such as, what do we know about the location generally, right?
Yes.
Is this a field in the middle of the woods, or is this a higher crime area, right?
Yes.
An officer is evaluating that as a process, as a part of the process involving the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
You look at other things such as tactical advantages or disadvantages. Agreed?
Yes.
So if you are not able to get what's called concealment or cover, that becomes a question, right?
In what?
Well, in a use of force, you're examining the surrounding area, right? To see if something happens, can I conceal and cover, right?
Yes.
You also, in addition to the scene security, you need to deal with securing the scene, which is different than scene security. Agreed?
Yes.
Scene security is maintaining the safety of everyone around, including yourself and your partners, right?
Yes.
Securing the scene is making sure that the scene itself is preserved and kept tight, right?
Correct. Yes.
And in fact, a police officer's responsibility and part of the use of force determination is to prevent or avoid the use of force against other people. Agreed?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you have to use force against one person to avoid using force against others, that's a factor that an officer should consider. Agreed?
I don't know if I would agree with that.
Okay. Again, within the training department, those people who are, it's their jobs to do that. They may be better to answer those questions?
Yes.
All right. And then even from there, you can widen the lens even further, and an officer will look at his training, right?
Yes.
What he is trained to do or not to do, right?
Yes.
He will look and take into experience, or he or she will take into account his or her own experience from their past career. Agreed?
Yes.
So things like fighting with someone, and what's the probability or possibility that that person is going to continue fighting with you in the future, right? Even after you have them subdued.
I don't know. I don't think I can agree to that totally, but
Okay.
I understand what you're saying.
There are circumstances where after a person is rendered unconscious, and then you perform, you revive that person, that they are more combative than they were initially. Agreed?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And again, in terms of your own past experience, an officer's own past experiences, they're taking that into consideration as well.
Sure.
Now, you testified that you were never, you have never been trained as a Minneapolis police officer to use a knee on the neck of a suspect.
That's correct.
You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?
Yes.
And that can even involve improvisation. Agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis Police Department policy allows a police officer to use whatever means are available to him to protect himself and others, right?
Yes.
So if there's a paint can sitting on the table and someone is attacking, you can use that paint can as a weapon.
Yes.
And in fact, you have been trained in the prone handcuffing techniques, correct?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that Minneapolis Police Department has never ever trained anyone to put their knee across the shoulder and to the base of the neck?
I didn't say that.
Okay? So you would agree then that pursuant to Minneapolis Police Department training, when a suspect is arrested and in the process of being handcuffed or being restrained, it would be consistent with the Minneapolis Police Department training you've received to place your knee across the shoulder to the base of the neck.
I don't know if I've, part of your question was handcuffing, and we've certainly been trained to put the knee on the shoulder, but I don't know about just restraining a person. I don't recall being trained in that, but.
Okay. Again, possible based on the circumstances.
Sure.
Right? And when an officer is restraining a person and has called for EMS, have you heard the term that we're holding this person for EMS?
Yes.
Okay. And essentially that means you want to keep them in that position until EMS arrives because they're more capable to deal with whatever this situation is. Agreed?
No, I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay. How would you describe the term hold for EMS?
Hold for EMS is that you are holding him for EMS or her.
And sometimes people are held for EMS in a restrained position. Agreed?
Yes, sometimes, yeah.
Now, you also testified that once a person is handcuffed, the threat, I think you said, is gone. It's at the lowest threat level, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that obviously, a person who's handcuffed can still pose a threat, right?
I suppose they could, yeah.
So an officer who is even though he has someone handcuffed, that person could continue to kick the officer.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
That person could continue to thrash his body around. Agreed?
Sure.
And part of the reason police officers restrain people is for that person's own safety. Agreed?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, it also presumes that the handcuffs were placed on correctly, right?
Yes.
Sometimes in a struggle or an attempt to handcuff someone, handcuffs aren't placed on properly and they can pop open or be too big for a suspect, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen them too big, you know, for a suspect. Sometimes they're too tight.
Okay.
But
if sometimes in the process of handcuffing someone, one handcuff goes on, thereby giving the suspect a potential weapon if he were to break free, right?
Yes.
Or she, for that
yes.
matter. And officers have been attacked with their own handcuffs, in your experience, right?
Oh yeah, yes.
So you would agree that the use of force is a dynamic series of decision making based on a lot of different information.
Absolutely.
And it's based upon a lot of information that is not necessarily captured on a body camera. Agreed?
Yes, that's correct.
The body camera is only so effective to show what the body camera sees and not what the officer sees.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of what you did in this particular case, essentially, you would be are you what's called Car 21? Is that the homicide unit? And I may
no, it's not.
Car 9? I don't know.
No.
You're just homicide. There's some car associated with homicide, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What car is that?
We would be car. Well, it would be like car 112 or 108 or 110.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
All right. So you got called, or you were made aware of this incident back on May 25th of 2020. You understood it to be a critical incident, correct?
Yes,
And it is Minneapolis Police Department policy to turn over the investigation of any critical incident, or the majority of critical incidents, we should say, to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, right?
yes,
And that is to avoid any potential conflicts between the involved officers, right?
yes, that's right.
And so your role, you heard this call came out, and you kind of self-assigned to show up here?
Yes,
And you did that because you wanted to make sure the scene was secure, right?
yes,
To make sure that the officers who had responded to the scene were doing the things that they should be doing in connection with a critical incident,
that's correct.
such as roping off or tying off the tape, or taping off the scene, I should say, right?
Putting up crime scene tape?
Yes.
Yes,
Not permitting citizens to come wandering through the scene, right?
yeah.
Canvassing the area, I think you said. And ultimately, your role in this particular case was limited to a couple of hours of time, making sure those things were done, and until BCA agents arrive and you handed off the scene, right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And it was not until later that you were asked to review the body-worn cameras of the officers and consider the use of force, right?
Yes,
And it would not be within your normal role or job duties to do such a use of force analysis, right?
that's correct.
I have no further questions.
Redirect?
Lieutenant Zimmerman, you had the opportunity to review the body-worn cameras from
Yes,
officers involved.
yes,
Did that also capture the bystanders on the sidewalk during the incident?
yes.
Was there something about that group of bystanders that in your assessment was sort of, an uncontrollable threat to the officers at the scene?
No,
Would there be a way, or, well, I mean, I ask it this way. Would there be other ways for officers to deal with bystanders?
yes,
And could that include calling for backup?
yes,
Would the presence of multiple officers at a scene be a relevant fact for an officer to consider when using an amount of force on a handcuffed and restrained subject?
no, it shouldn't be.
Well, but if there's some concern about the crowd, would it be relevant that there were other officers already at the scene?
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, it doesn't matter, the crowd, as long as they're not attacking you. The crowd really shouldn't have an effect on your actions.
You were asked if the use of force training has changed over time,
Yes,
okay, but you still get the most up-to-date training every year when you go to the use of force training.
I do, yes.
And you were asked about, has the academy changed since you went to the academy?
Yes,
And you haven't been through the academy since then, correct?
right, yeah,
But you have some familiarity with how the academy trains new officers.
absolutely.
And do you think that academy training provides appropriate training for officers
Yes, it should.
and would provide the most up-to-date training on the use of force for Minneapolis officers that take the academy type training?
Yes,
You were asked if you were a trainer, and you are not a use of force trainer.
that's correct.
You are a student in
Yes.
use of force. And, but it's your testimony that based on all the training you go through every year, it's well known that the prone position is dangerous.
Absolutely, yes.
Doesn't take a trainer to be able to say that. You've learned it.
Yes,
And that's been something that's been trained repeatedly.
absolutely. That hasn't changed.
You were asked about the critical decision-making model.
Yes,
Familiar with that from your training?
yes,
And part of that is continually reassessing the need for force.
correct.
It's a fair statement?
Yes,
And so that would include reassessing the location,
yes,
the tactical advantage,
yes,
conceal and cover,
yes,
scene security,
yes,
security and scene,
yes,
or security of the scene,
yes,
medical distress of the person restrained,
yes,
When you watched the body camera videos, did those videos capture those types of circumstances relative to the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
yes,
And you were able to assess those things in telling the jury what you thought earlier about the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
I am.
When you watched those videos, at some point during the restraint, did you see Mr. Floyd kicking the officers?
No, I didn't.
It may have happened initially, but after that, did you see any kicking?
No, none.
Defense counsel asked you about the concept of holding for EMS.
Yes,
So sometimes it's necessary to keep the person there so they can receive medical treatment.
that's correct.
Does holding for EMS excuse an officer from providing medical attention that they've been trained to provide?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from continuing to use this decision-making model about the use of force?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from using other resources like other officers at the scene to
No.
deal? You were asked about handcuffs. If handcuffs are not properly locked, can they tighten?
Yes.
Can they loosen?
I'm sorry?
If they're properly connected, can they loosen?
Mhm.
They can come open. But if they're locked, can they still tighten?
That's right.
If they're not, I think the term is double locked.
Right, yes.
And based on your review of the body cams, did you see any need for Officer Chauvin to improvise by putting his knee on Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No, I did not.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Any requests? No, All right. Thank you, Lieutenant. You may step down.
Thank you.